So I wanted to ask before we start, what's the plan for Zim? Because last time we spoke, you were longing to go back, and now you're there. Are you planning on staying permanently, or is this just for lockdown stuff?
No, this is just for lockdown. I was actually supposed to be going back to Germany in like 10 days, and then my flight got cancelled. So
Cool.
I was like, oh, that's terrible. Not so terrible. So look, it was like lockdown is really, it's quite stressful.
Yeah.
If it's super freezing cold.
Yeah.
And obviously for me, one of the things that I started to worry about a little bit more was that, like, okay, my family, like, when am I gonna see them? Like,
Yeah.
it was just going on and on and on. So I saw a window of opportunity to leave the country, and I jumped and took it. And I was like, I don't know, like, when I'll come back and whatever. So I just like basically I packed for like 6 weeks because that was what I had planned. But I was like, if I'm stuck, I'm stuck, and it's fine. So now the whole problem is this whole like South African variant, which I think is really rooted in racism, because I don't think it's any more deadly than any of the other ones.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, South Africa need to step up their PR, man, and just be like, it's not any more deadly than the other one.
Yeah.
So now it's like this whole South African variant, and it's now spreading in Germany, by the way, the South African variant from a family that came from South Africa. And I was like, well, how do you know? Maybe it's been circulating for ages and we just weren't sequencing them.
Yeah.
So who knows? So so at the moment, Zim is in lockdown. So Zim is in lockdown. So I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if you could travel, traveling is not super fun at the moment with all the precautions. Yes, I can. Are you still there? Hello? Am I stuck?
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me? Oh, I can hear you. Yeah, you're stuck.
Oh, no. Okay, it's fine on my side. I can hear you crisp and clear. So just let me know if I drop off again.
Perfect now.
Cool. Cool. I was just saying, cool. Even if you could travel, it's really not fun to travel because of all the precautions you have to take, and like, sanitizing everywhere and masks the entire time. So like probably nicer to just buckle down and enjoy the warmer weather anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sad about that at all.
Yeah.
I'm not sad at all.
But coronavirus and lockdowns aside, Chiedza, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to finally get to chat to you again. We had our initial chat last year, which already feels an age away, but it's really nice to have you and get to chat to you.
I know, right? Great. I'm very, very happy to be here. Finally. It feels like it's been a while. So I'm really, really happy.
Cool. Before we dive into our interview or our conversation, I have a few questions just to get to know you a bit better. You couldn't prep for them. They're very easy, and you should just sort of like say what comes to mind. Don't think too hard about them. But our first one to dive in, after a really tiring day, how do you spend your evening?
Shower, eat, sleep. Oh, and Netflix. I should be honest. And Netflix. So I should be honest.
Nice. Yes, and then tea and coffee. And how do you take it?
Coffee, 1 sugar, lactose-free milk.
Ooh, cool. I also take soy milk. I used to take lactose-free milk because I was lactose intolerant, but now I've just gone full vegan. So I'm just doing the soy milk.
Oh, okay. Yeah, soy milk, I've tried it and I was just like,
it's not for everyone. Yeah.
No, it's really not.
And then what's a really good work-related book that you have read recently?
Oh, work-related book. Oh gosh, the name is escaping me. Oh my gosh, and I was just reading it just now. It's gonna come back to me. I'm so sorry.
We will
I've
bank
just like
that
gone
one.
Completely blank.
Cool.
And please bank that one. It's just
And then what is something you wish existed but doesn't yet?
Ooh. Um, ooh. If I could get home from Europe in like 3 hours, that would be amazing.
Some speedy
And
time
I'd be home
travel,
all the
time
time.
warp, some kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, I'd be home like every 2 weeks.
And then what is something you're glad you said no to recently and why?
Ooh, what did I say? I'm trying to think what should I say no to recently. Um, I think a few months ago I turned down a job, a particular job. It was a toss up between the one I have now and then the one that I would have taken. And yeah, I'm just in retrospect now, I'm like, I definitely made the right decision. I'm in the right place. So yeah, I'm glad I said no. It was very difficult though,
Yeah.
because you never know, right? You always feel like, what if this is not the right thing, and what if this goes wrong? But yeah, I'm glad I said no.
Cool. And then last question, what is something that cost you less than 50 euros, but was the best investment most recently?
This is so easy. A humidifier. So I
Oh,
have
nice.
crazy, number one, I have crazy allergies. And then the other thing is that in summertime, when it's like super, super hot, my skin would get really, really dry overnight. So I was waking up with like, flaky skin. And then I bought a humidifier on Amazon. It was like 42 euros, I think, but that was a game changer. It was literally, I was just waking up and one of my friends, it was funny because one of my friends called me in the morning and I answered on FaceTime and she was like, why do you look like you've just walked off a movie set? And I was like, I'm moisturized all night.
That is
So yeah, best
so
investment
funny.
ever.
Fantastic. Cool. So if you think of the book, then just give me a shout. But
Yeah, I
otherwise,
can't believe I can't remember.
let's just say
But it
it
was
wasn't
so
that
good.
impactful.
Yeah, maybe.
But cool. So thanks so much for a little introduction. It's really, really interesting to hear some of your answers to those questions. But diving into a conversation, just to give a little bit of context into what we're talking
Mhm.
about. So as someone who's a leader in the tech space, part of what makes your approach to leadership so interesting to me is that you essentially try to set yourself up and your team up in a way that you as a leader can make yourself redundant as possible. And key to that is how you think about constantly building what you call the succession plan for yourself, and also
Mhm.
helping your team run and operate without you being like the bottleneck or the blocker for actually getting things done. And that's what our conversation is about today. Before we dive into like what that looks like practically and like what a succession plan actually means, can you just tell me about what does this idea of building a succession plan mean to you? Like, what is that all about? What is the essence of that practice?
Yep, absolutely. Succession planning to me is, identifying, nurturing, and developing up and coming leaders within an organization. So, looking at who do we have today, and what stage are all these different people at, and who are the people who are, showing signs and displaying competencies of being leaders. So, to me, that's what succession planning, and it's planning their path to getting to the next role, and head of, and director of, etc. So that's what succession planning is. Obviously not to be done in a vacuum, right? This is
Yeah.
to be done in conjunction with like HR, especially around learning and development. And then you have to think about things like remuneration, titles, and it's actually a multifaceted sort of thing. But obviously, if it's in my department, then I would be the one who's can identify some of these traits. So yes, that's what succession planning means to me.
So, in your experience as a leader, why do you think that
Mhm.
that's so important? And maybe you can like tell me a story or tell me about
Yeah.
a moment when you realized why that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I realized it was important was I got quite unwell. I had a period of time when I was really unwell, and then there was a period where now I was, heading up quite a big team, and I needed to go on medical leave for 2.5 months. Which is quite a while when you think about
Yeah.
tech and sprints being 2 weeks, right? So if we're thinking about being away from work for 10 weeks, you're talking about 5 sprints, which is quite significant.
Yeah.
And the thing that dawned on me, and when I was thinking about, I was writing up all of the handover notes, there was no clear person who I could say, this person is my number two, and this is the person that you should go to in my absence. So what I tried to do was to sort of share the responsibilities across a group of people while I was away, which caused, number one, it caused complete chaos because everybody was like, well, because to me it was very clear, like, for this you go to this person, for this you go to this person. But what was really missing was, what about the stuff that is not related to a particular product line or particular project? Then who do we go to? And I just didn't have that person. And I think as the days grew closer to me going on medical leave, the gravity of that situation kind of hit me quite hard. And so what we had to do in the end was that my boss had to be the person that effectively was going to cover that role in my absence. So I took a lot from that. I think some of my team were very, very disappointed. I think part of it was also because I was afraid of just sort of, saying, right, this is the person, because I didn't want to hurt other people's feelings. But in doing that, I caused problems anyways. So, yeah.
So why do you say your team was disappointed? Maybe just help me understand where that came from.
I think the disappointment was there were a couple of people who felt like they were next in line.
Right,
sounds
cool.
Sounds all very royal. But they felt like, okay, she's the head of in this position. And then, I'm definitely the person who would then be identified as being the one in charge in my absence. So this is where the disappointment came. And it came from, I'd say maybe two to three people who thought they would have been quite good for it. So yeah, that's where I would say that they were disappointed.
So what's interesting there is, I think, something you mentioned about how you felt about taking medical leave, which is like, there's no one who can like directly or immediately take your role, that you felt afraid. And I think that's really important, because I wonder how many leaders out there don't take leave as often as they should, don't spend as much time with their family or their friends or on personal projects, because they think that all of this responsibility lies on them. And if they're not there, it's not going to work. Which I think, like, if a leader experiences burnout from that kind of stuff, my guess is that filters through like the team as well, to some to some degree. So I think I imagine a lot of people relate to those feelings you had. I mean, you had to take medical leave, but someone may say, "Oh, I can't go away this weekend. We're running a sprint. They need me." Those kinds of feelings or thoughts are quite common in people who don't have these succession plans.
Definitely. And it's the heaviness of the responsibility, right? And feeling like, if something goes wrong in my absence, then like, what does that mean? And I always need to be on, I need to be there all the time. Going on medical leave for something like 10 weeks is a really big deal, right? You need to physically and mentally be in a really good space, because, people think about medical recovery just as a physical thing, but it's actually really not just a physical thing. There's so much mental and emotional stuff that goes into your recovery. And one thing that I realized is I had a few sort of procedures, but the ones where I recovered the best was when mentally and emotionally I was in such a good place. I was really calm, I was really happy, I was really positive. And then the times I didn't recover so well was more when I was very, very stressed out. So you also have to think about investing the time now in taking a break, which actually will pay off in the future, because otherwise, you'll do what I used to do when I was a lot younger, when I was first a leader, and that was just burning myself out and running on fumes. So this is something that I've really learned now. So when I switch off now, I actually really switch completely off.
That's super cool. I mean, what is this succession plan, like what does building a succession plan do to the way you lead your team? Like, what does that approach require from you as a tech leader? We'll go through the practical details just now, but just as like a high level, what does this approach require from you as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, it requires a lot of structure and a lot of planning. So what it means really is that I'll be able to identify the up and coming leaders, and every one-to-one we have, it moves a little bit away from the individual contributor stuff that they're doing, because that is obviously something that they're doing pretty well. And then now we're looking more around how are you responding to different situations? How are you managing people? So more around the softer skills and the leadership skills. So they're one-to-one sessions. I would say that they're much more around like coaching and mentoring rather than like directing someone in the individual contributor role. So from my side, there's a lot of planning, right? I've got a notebook full of notes. And I always say that my brain is like compartmentalized with each person. So I know every person in my team, like this is what we need to focus on and this is what they're doing super well. This is where they need to do some improving. So yeah, on my side, there's a lot of stuff that goes into planning what those steps are. And not just planning it, but also how can we manifest these different situations so I can see that they are managing to cope with these things. So what are the projects they're working on? Are they giving them the opportunities to then develop and grow these skills that they need when they are becoming leaders? So I also have to look at the organization and think, okay, maybe this is a good project for this person to go on because they need to improve on X, Y, Z. So there's actually a lot of like strategizing and planning that I have to do to make sure that the succession planning is actually in motion.
So I think, I mean, you've mentioned some of the structure and process just now, which I think we can unpack a little bit and maybe even look at like how you set up your notebook or how you structure those one-on-ones and stuff. But I just wanted to pull on a thread you mentioned because I think it might be an interesting distinction to just like lay on the table quite clearly. You said the difference between like coaching and mentoring versus directing someone. I don't know if you can just tell me more about that.
Yeah, sure. So when you are managing someone who's maybe like a more junior member of staff and very firmly in the individual contributor role, what you're doing is you're focusing a lot on their output, right? So if we're talking about people who are in product, we're talking about, is your backlog well prioritized? What's the structure of your user stories? How are you conducting all of your meetings, etc.? So you're really, really focusing on the quality aspect of it because that's where they need to grow the most at the highest rate. So then when you're talking about the one-to-ones that you have with that group, then it's really kind of very focused on that side of things. When you're talking about up and coming leaders, you then have to structure your one-to-ones a little bit differently and make it a little bit more situational. So you ask them to say, okay, can you, when you come to the one-to-ones, let's bring like maybe 2 or 3 situations that you found quite difficult and also situations that you found super easy and straightforward where you feel like you've succeeded yourself. And then we unpack that. We unpack how they conducted themselves. We unpack what was going on in the session. We unpack, okay, could we maybe have done things a little bit better? And what I'm really kind of looking for there is a thread of continuous improvement. And also one thing I also really, really want to see is self-reflection. So someone who can sit back and say, and self-reflection and being critical of yourself, criticizing yourself in an unhealthy way are 2 very, very different things. And that's something I had to learn as well, because I'm actually very, very self-critical, which is not a healthy thing, And I think one thing that I want to see is that you are actually reflecting on yourself and thinking, you know what, this happened. On reflection, I could have actually done X, Y, Z, which could potentially have led to better outcomes. And being very open to unpacking those different situations and discussing them. So that's where the nuance is in the different kind of one-to-ones, depending on the level that the person is at.
Cool, that makes sense. So if I'm understanding correctly, just to paraphrase, the part of building a succession plan is adjusting the structure of those one-to-ones, and that if it's a junior person, you'll probably still work in quite a output-driven, directive thing where you're trying to help them, learn the ropes of what it is to be in that team. Whereas when you're building a succession plan with older or more senior people in your team, that you start to tweak from more of a directive to more of a coaching and mentorship, where you're trying to move them along in certain areas.
Yeah.
Cool. That makes sense. So the first thing that diving into a little bit more of a practical view of your, like how you build a succession plan. The first thing I wanted to unpack, because I think it's interesting, is like, tell me what your notebook looks like. When you said you have quite a structured notebook, how do you organize it so that what does that look like?
First of all, it's so sad I don't have my notebook in this room because it's
would have loved to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got like butterflies. So every single notebook of mine has either got butterflies or flowers. And it's
Beautiful.
always like very, 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 I mean, I don't want to say this, like very girly, right?
Yeah.
So that's what my notebook looks like. And in there I have every day, it's like the date. And then I have a name, and then I have notes, just mental notes about what did I discuss with this person? What did I notice? What am I really happy about that came out of the session? What am I concerned about that came out of the session? And just like important things that I need to remember. So everything has a name, either a person's name, if it's a one-to-one session, or a meeting name. So then I remember the context of it. Because if you think about like my role, I have to look after like a number of teams, right? So they're all like different product lines. So I can go from one meeting about like accounts and payments to another meeting that's about billing and internal services. So I need to understand like what meeting was it. So that's kind of what I put in there. In terms of the one-to-ones are at the back. So the meetings, my day-to-day meetings are at the front, the one-to-ones are at the back. So in there, I kind of just put notes to myself for the next session to think about, okay, what do I need to kind of bring into the next session? What do we need to talk about? What do I want to ask them to prep for the next session? What was I really happy about that happened in the session? What am I a little bit concerned about? And I think especially in the times now of the pandemic, I think, you know, even on a video call as a leader, I need to be able to notice, like, does this person seem okay? How are they coming across? Have they changed? Like, what's their tone like? You know, is the general, when you're talking to them, are they generally more positive, or are they generally getting a little bit more negative? Just to see, because it's really difficult now to know, because I'm not seeing them in person. So it's quite difficult for me to tell how people are doing. So what I try to do at the beginning of our one-to-ones is just, you know, I have an agenda that we have in the meeting, and every single one-to-one is, how are you doing? And then in brackets, I put for real.
Yeah.
So every, you know, because people are a bit like, yeah, I'm good. And I'm just like, are you though?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah. So, I mean, on that, I think it's interesting. I assume that, you know, you're obviously trying to figure out what each person would be able to grow into when it comes to like the succession plan, like what kind of roles or responsibilities would they like to work towards. How do you reflect that in those notes? And how do you actually use that information? Like how do you build that into the one-to-ones, that you actually are guiding them as opposed to telling them to go here?
Yeah, so we have, what I built up is a competency framework. So this is like all the different levels within the product team. And then there's also a career ladder. So, you know, there's like a, you know, from here, you can go here. And it's not just a straight line, because I really encourage people to think about going into different avenues, because I think one of the most difficult things is that a lot of people feel like, oh, for me to go up in my career and become a, you know, head of whatever, I have to manage people. Not everybody wants to manage people, and not everybody should manage people. So there are completely different routes that you can take. And, you know, one thing that I love doing is opening people's eyes to loads of different roles. So, you know, if you want to progress in product as an individual contributor, you can just become a master of your craft. There's actually a role and a path for that. So there's that path. If you want to become even more technical, you can actually move towards product architecture. That's a thing. So then there's also that route. And then there's also the route of that you can become, you know, what I've done, which is kind of go master of craft and also people leadership, which is like a head of product role. So what we do in the one-to-ones is we start that discussion. Like I never push anyone into saying like, you need to do this, you need to do that. But I say to them, you're really strong in these areas. And I think you should really kind of think about, you know, have you thought about this path, and what would you see, what do you see yourself doing in a few years' time or a few months or whatever? And then we talk about the projects that they're working on and saying, okay, for example, if you want to become a product architect, is the project that you're working on going to give you enough to chew on to actually get a taste of what that role could give you? So there's also that side of things where I have to think about what they're actually working on and where they want to go. But it's important, because I think one thing that I realize is so important nowadays is you have to be so intentional about what you want to do, because you have to put yourself in the right situations, get the right opportunities, and shine so people see that, okay, this person really is going in that area. If you're not intentional, then you kind of just sleepwalk into different situations that might not actually be your strengths, or it's not something that you're super happy with. So I think there's a lot there actually in responsibility on the actual individual as well to be very driven to say, these are my plans, this is my intention. I can only take you so far, but then the rest is also then up to you.
So just so I'm understanding, what does the competency ladder I mixed them both up there. The competency framework and the career ladder actually look like? Like, is it a doc that you share with them? Is it just like a conversation you have?
Yeah, it's a document. So it's a Google sheet. I wish it was Excel, but anyways, let's not go into that. But it's like, it's a Google sheet. So on one axis, we have the different role titles and levels. And then on the other axis, we actually have the competencies. So for example, in my current organization, the product managers, so I have 3 different teams, so product design, product management, and product marketing. So they all report into me. So I'll pick product management for the sake of this conversation to simplify it. So they have 7 competencies. And then depending on the level, then there are different requirements for each competency, right? So for example, one of the competencies is management, but management is not applicable until you get to a certain level. Then you start to see some requirements. But for example, I'll pick like 3. So we have strategic thinking, we have user science and empathy, and then we have details and quality. So the difficulty and expectations obviously increase the higher up that you go. So you can see some of them, for example, will say you can do XYZ with help at one level, and then the next level might say with minimal help, and then the next level will say with no supervision. So that's how people then understand, like, okay, at this level, this is what, and it makes the conversation a lot easier to have because there's something that you can all refer to. And then one thing that I always ask people is, okay, show me a situation where you feel like you're actually higher up than where you are today. And then we make that real, and then we have a really healthy discussion around that.
So I think if I'm understanding correctly, this competency framework works almost both ways. It's one for you to be able to say, like, I think you're really strong in this area, and here are the roles that you could work towards that, like, use that strength. But also to be able to say, if you want to like really succeed in that role, here are some of the competencies that we can still work on, or that we can build and develop. So it's almost like a roadmap and a North Star for you to have. And then I assume you check on that every one-on-one. You do you go through that as well, or do you do it less often?
We don't do it as often as we should. This is something that I want to do a little bit more often. So we are going to be using it much, much more. I think what I was doing is, I've been at the company just over 6 months. So it was kind of building that out, trying to make sure that people actually understand it. And then we also had like an exercise of like leveling. So understanding where does everybody sit within this framework. And then now we're really going to use it to propel people to go to the next level. So this was like one of my biggest projects that I took on when I started.
Cool. And then just a question I had as well, like how does this, because you said it makes conversations easier. Why does having this framework make your conversations easier?
I think it makes it easier because we're looking at the same thing and we have to synthesize everything to basically point to the same thing. So we're not just like talking about abstract things that both of us don't understand. It does take a while to get people into it, to actually understand like, okay, but I don't really get what's the difference between these 2 levels. But if we bring like real life situations or real life examples, or I can point to some output and say, okay, let's look at this output. Let's look at the competency. Like together, let's discuss like what would I expect at this level? And then what would you expect? And then we come to some agreement and some middle ground, and people are like, oh, okay, now I understand what you're saying. Because without having something that everybody's looking at as a standard, it just becomes a I think and you think situation. So I think having that is something that's a bit more neutral, so people can point to it and actually understand it. But the hardest part is getting everyone to buy into it and understand it, because that's really like the hard part. That's where the work really comes in, around influencing and being able to explain it. And it's not an easy thing to explain.
Yeah. So have you learned anything about getting people to buy into that? Like, what would you tell your younger self about doing that well?
Oh, God. Yeah. I would tell my younger self to be more collaborative I think I learned quite a lot. And the thing is, it differs from company to company. But I think one thing that would be a better way to do it is write down the competencies and define them, share them with the team. That's because that's actually the pillar, right? The pillar is actually the competencies. So break them down and say, okay, this is what I mean by strategic thinking. This is what I mean by collaboration. Because I think it's quite overwhelming for everyone to just go straight in with this massive sheet of all this stuff. And everyone's just like, well, I don't understand. Like, what does collaboration mean to you? What does collaboration mean to me? So with another team, one of the newer teams that I've taken on, I've done it another way. So I've defined the competencies, and we're at the point now where I've shared them, we've discussed them, and now they have an opportunity to comment. Cool. Then I will build out the competency framework. So that's definitely a learning that I took from the last time I did it a few months ago.
Cool. That's useful. So like collaboratively build it as opposed to just saying, here it is. Yeah.
Exactly. Because the people need to understand, like, okay, why is this the pillar and why is this the standard? Like, how did you come up with these competencies? Why are they the ones that you've chosen? Because let's be honest, I've got 7, I've put 7 down, but product managers, it's like they have loads and loads. They're probably like 30 or 40.
Yeah.
Why those particular ones? Why those 7? So really getting into that conversation and having a conversation with people so they understand, like, okay, this is why I've picked these 7.
Yeah. I mean, how do you pick competencies? Like, what do you use to decide?
Yeah. So for me, one thing that is, I look at obviously the sector, right? And I mean, I'm really biased. I've always been in financial services. So looking at financial services and just kind of looking at what are people's expectations of, number one, the way we build products. There's so much regulation. So you've got to be so on point with details and quality. There's so much stuff around like technical understanding and being able to work with architects and all these different people, because you have to interpret, like, I don't know, regulatory stuff, business stuff, and then translate it into what people need to build. I'm not saying other sectors don't have that, but I'm just saying, like, with finance stuff, there's so much more baked into it around like standards and the law, and also the sensitivity that you're handling people's money. So this is actually a really big deal. And then the other thing is I also just think about like just the basics of what makes a project run well. Like, what are the things that a product person needs to show in terms of competencies that a project runs super, super well. So I'm really like passionate about collaboration and communication. And then when I think about strategic thinking, it's about like, how does someone knit all of these different concepts together to make sure that like everybody's like moving in the same direction. You might be working on your project, but what I love to see is people who are very cognizant that if I change something here, this could benefit someone here, or it's going to affect someone else further down the line. Let me proactively reach out to them and talk to them about it and say, hey, raise a flag, this is happening, instead of finding out about it in like a tech roundtable when everyone's talking about like, oh, we're releasing this, and everyone's like, what? So these are the things that kind of helped me to choose the competencies. And just my own experience as well. Just, the things that I've done in my past and that I feel have helped me to get to where I am, because I guess, I have to be competent in some things to be able to get to where I am. So that's also influenced a lot of what I think is important.
So I think we've been walking around how this helps with the succession plan. But if you can just like make it super clear in like a sentence or two, how does having this competency framework and having walked people through this competency framework help with a succession plan if you need to take medical leave? Like, what does having that do?
What that does, number one, as a leader, it means when I need to go on medical leave again, I know this is the person, or these two, I can choose between these two people to run the show in my absence. And then the second thing is it also helps me to say, do I need to leave some provision in place? Because I know that based on the framework and the succession plan, they're still lacking a little bit in this area. So I might need someone to have a little bit of oversight in this, because I know that they're still struggling. So this is what it really kind of helps. I know it sounds a little bit selfish. It's not just about me, but I think from a leader's perspective, it really kind of helps to know that these are the 1 or 2 people I can leave in place. However, I still need to leave this kind of provision as well to kind of help them along with some things they're still struggling with. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think I can imagine it also helps with people, you were saying your team was disappointed. People become less disappointed because they can understand your reasoning. You actually have like a thing to point to and say, like,
Definitely.
I picked this person for this because this is where they're at with this framework, and people can be like, cool, that makes sense. I don't have that yet, or I'm still working on that. Which I think helps as well communicate. As you said, you've got a thing that everyone has agreed on, that everyone works off of. It's not this abstract I think you think. It's a bit more structured, which helps a lot. So I think you've given a lot of practical insight into how you've set it up. The one thing which I wanted to maybe see if we could, I guess, almost role play, but one of the things you mentioned was this idea of people bringing situational examples to the one-to-ones, and you talking through that. So just pretend I'm someone on your team. If I brought an example of, like, I don't know, I had to, something I'm struggling with at the moment was, is doing presentations. Like when it comes to pitching something to my team, I really struggle to like communicate that, or I don't feel like people are really understanding what I'm saying. What would be your process for starting to unpack that with me?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I'd ask you is, how did you feel about when you were going into the presentation? So how did you feel about your preparation? How did you go about your preparation? And then even like in the session, I would ask you, did you send an agenda beforehand with some pre-information for people to digest a little bit so they know what they're coming into? The other question I would ask is, just tell me about how you picked the people who are attending the session, and what did you want them, what did you want them to learn, or what did you want them to bring to the table? And do you feel like you gave them enough information to do that? So did you give them enough information to know, like, I might ask you this, or I might need you to contribute this, or I might need you to take this away? How does this align with your current thinking? And then the other thing I would ask is, why do you perceive that you are struggling? What makes you think that you are struggling? Then another thing that I always ask people is, did you ask other people who attended the session what they thought and their feedback? Because a lot of times what I find with people, and it's exactly the same with me, I can come out of an interview and be like, that was a train smash. That was absolutely horrendous. And then it comes out with the most glowing feedback. And then I'm just like, we cannot have been in the same place. Like, this was not the same, because of the way we perceive ourselves and how we feel. And we just put ourselves in this, like, I have to be like at 150% 24/7. And we expect so much of ourselves and put ourselves under so much pressure to the point where we actually paralyze ourselves. So that's one thing I always say, ask other people what their perception was. And then I might ask them to just walk me through the material and say, okay, maybe let's talk about the material and stuff like that. And then usually, people kind of are like, oh, actually, maybe it wasn't that bad. And then maybe I could have done this. And actually, that's a good point about the agenda. I hadn't really thought about that. And priming people beforehand. I always tell people, prime people before you want them to do something. Don't put people on the spot, because people don't like that. People react quite badly to these kind of things.
Yeah.
So always prime people, take the time to prime people. And then also, if it is something where you need someone to help you make a big decision, do a role play with one of your peers. Or if I have time, you can also run it by me as well. I'm very happy to, help you prepare. Because sometimes what also helps is an outside person's perspective on the material. Because someone might be like, oh, but this is not super clear to me. And then someone will be like, oh, actually, no, that's a really, really good point. And then, the other thing is also, how engaging are you when you're doing presentations, So one thing that I like doing is, like, I can be a bit goofy and funny, I guess, in meetings, because what I want to do is, people think like, oh, head of product, you know what I mean? And then I just want to kind of go into these sessions with like something that's funny, and just so people are just like, oh, actually, she's just a normal human being and she's like pretty chilled out, which also just, makes people more comfortable being in a meeting with you. So that's something that's really important to me, is that people also are more engaging, and you're not just like super cold, like, this is just business, also make it a bit real and kind of calm.
Yeah.
I think the other day my nephew, I was on a all company call and I unmuted by mistake. And then my nephew started drawing on himself with a pen and I started like shouting at him. And then everyone was like, oh, you know, we can all hear you. And I was like, oh, you know, so I put it on mute. And then I went into another meeting and they hadn't been there. And I was like, oh, you'll never believe what happened to me today. I've just had the worst start to my day. And everyone laughed. Then the meeting was like super chilled out because people were just like, oh, Chiedza, that's hilarious. So I think sometimes it's just, you know, creating a good atmosphere. And then the last thing is also what I asked them is, okay, was there anyone in that session who was particularly quiet, who you would have liked to contribute a little bit more? And then, you know, a lot of times they're like, oh, actually there was. And I'm like, okay, are you actively trying to build a relationship and rapport with that person? Because maybe they're not good in group sessions, but they're much, much better one-to-one. So you need to invest time in that, because a lot of stuff with product is around relationships. It's around relationships. It's around building that camaraderie with people. And it's also about people feeling psychologically safe to express what they think. So you have to build that relationship with people. So that's how I would kind of go about a session where we unpack a situation.
Cool. That helps a lot. Thanks. Do you tie those to the competency framework explicitly, or do you ask people to bring situations based on a particular like, I guess, competency that you're working on, or is there like a direct link between those two things?
Yeah, so I'm not as explicit in terms of the competency framework, which was definitely a learning for me going forward, is to actually be much more explicit, saying, okay, this has happened, and then, you know, this ties to this. I've had like feedback sessions like towards the end of last year where it was very explicit, where I tied different situations to the competency framework, which was helpful. And I found like, oh, actually, this took us to the next level of understanding each other when we're talking about things. So I think going forward is definitely something that I'm going to do much, much more. So I think for each person, I've kind of planned out like, okay, you're going to run with this project, you're going to run with that project, because we really want to focus on this competency, et cetera, et cetera. So that tying to like the particular competency is also a very, very good thing.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, just your line of questioning with my example, I think speaks to that competency thing, because on the surface, it might have looked like I struggle with presentations or communicating, whereas through asking me about, you know, almost how did I feel, you know, what happened, what were the actual conditions around that, it might have come up, I don't ask for feedback enough. And that had I done that, I would have been able to present better. So you're better able to see where someone can work, or where you can actually support them, because it's not always, you know, something you can just take at face value. Yeah. So the background has changed because we've moved venues.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's all good.
This is going to be really weird. People will be like, "What's going on here?"
What happened?
The joys of being at home.
Remote work perks. But cool. So just to sort of like close the loop and tie things together, like if there is like one piece of advice that you've been given, or one thing that you've learned about, you know, tech leadership and being head of product over the years, that you think others could value from hearing, what would that be?
Be yourself. Be as authentic as possible. And I know this sounds so like, yeah. It sounds very like hippie or whatever, but, you know, really, really be yourself. Because the thing is, if you're not yourself, you're going to have this internal war all the time between the person who you're projecting on the outside and who you actually are on the inside. And that takes energy, and that takes energy away from being an effective leader. So, you know, be yourself, and people will always have comments about your style and who you are, how you come across. And I think you also have to really think about who's giving me this feedback, and should I really listen to it, right? You don't have to listen to like every single piece of feedback. I think for me, one of the things that has been really, really important is for me to really be like, you know what? I am who I am. My leadership style is very servant leadership, you know, much more on the nurturing side. I'm not a micromanager. You know, I want people to go off and do things, you know, go off and succeed, go off and fail, go off and whatever. I will always be there. I'll always be there in the background, but I want you to be free, and I want you to try things out, but I'm always going to be there. Instead of being the anxious leader who's like, I'm going to do everything so that I don't give you even the opportunity to fail, because the times that I've learned the most in my career are the times that I have failed and things
Yeah.
have gone like completely wrong.
Yeah.
And that's when I've learned the biggest lessons, not when someone has been like dictating to me, like, do this, do that, because then there's no free thinking. I can't actually grow. And then the same thing is that I can't then pass that on to someone else. But what I do very actively with my team is I share experiences of like where something's gone wrong. So if I say to them, I really think you should do it like this because I did it like how you were about to do it and it went completely wrong. So I really would urge you to, and I always try and use this kind of language. I really would urge you. I think it's a very good idea if you try it like this, unless it's something that's, very, what would I say? Like it's business critical. Then I'll be like, no, you're going to do it like this. Like this is just what you're going to do. Then yes, then I will do that. But if it's not in that vein, then I will say, I'm giving you this advice because, I want you to succeed. I want you to do, etc. But it's also up to you. And you must also think for yourself.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, that part about like being yourself and just accepting how you go about things. And, it's different leadership styles are effective in different ways. But I think for me, where I really started to enjoy leadership was when I was like, you know what, this is who I am and it's completely fine. I don't have to be like this person or this person to be a good leader. So, and I feel like much more energy. I feel like less stressed out because I'm not trying to be someone else. I'm just being me.
Chiedza, thank you so much for being yourself and chatting to me about about being head of product and building a succession plan. I think it's a really interesting approach to leadership that I think often becomes secondary because it's there's a lot of things you have to do. And your example is great, as you only really thought about it when you had to take medical leave, but it's something that you get a lot of benefit out of doing proactively. So I think that's, it's really cool to think about and it's a really cool discussion to have. So thank you for sharing your experience and some of your insights and lessons.
Definitely. I mean, one thing that I think I'd love to kind of add, if I can, just a little bit, it's also for myself, right? I have things that I need to learn. I have things where I need to grow. So I also would love a leader who can identify those things where I need to grow. So what's my succession plan for the chief product officer, right? So there are a couple of areas for me, for example, that I know I definitely need to focus on because, for example, I don't have like an accounting background, but there's a lot of stuff like if you think about investor reporting and things like that, there's like financial forecasting and things. So I also need to grow in that kind of aspect. So I think it's this whole concept of making sure you always remember that you also have to learn, right? As much as you're helping other people, you also have to learn and you also have to move to the next level because you always need new ideas. You always need new blood. You always need something fresh, right? I mean, products are evolving and changing like crazy. I started working maybe 12 years ago or 13 years ago. I cannot tell you how product development has just, it feels like it's turned on its head. It's completely different from when I started. So if I did not evolve with the times, or have people who were interested in pushing me, where would I be today?
But cool, thank you for that little wrap up and that little addition. Like I said, it was really, really nice chatting to you and hearing from you. Thank you for joining me.
It was lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. And also love the way you prepare me for this as well. Give me some time to think. So yeah, I'm really, really grateful.
Cool.
And yeah, very glad that we've connected.